Tonight, let us gently journey with a sense of quiet reverence and deep introspection into the true, often unvarnished expanse of the Old West, moving far beyond the captivating, frequently exaggerated silver screen narratives of daring heroes and dramatic confrontations into the stark, demanding, and utterly relentless reality where each and every sunrise offer no guarantees of safety, comfort, or even continued existence, and where survival was a daily, often grueling, negotiation with a world both beautiful and brutal. You might quietly believe in your own inherent resilience, imagining you possess the fortitude, the inner strength to endure such a time, to stand strong against its trials. But it was, without exaggeration, a period of profound wildness, a raw, untamed wilderness in every conceivable aspect, a constant test of the human spirit. If these quiet explorations of history, human endurance, and the often overlooked facets of the past resonate deeply with you, stirring a sense of wonder or contemplation, a gentle tap of the like button, or even a thoughtful subscription would be deeply appreciated. It aids this humble endeavor more than you might fully realize, fostering the continued creation of these contemplative narratives, allowing these quiet journeys into history to reach more receptive ears. I often find myself wondering, in these quiet moments, from what distant corner of our vast interconnected world you are currently listening. Perhaps if you feel so inclined, you might consider sharing your location in the comments below, and even the local time there. It's a quiet, unexpected joy, a source of gentle connection to see our small global gathering connect through these shared stories and reflections, bridging geographical divides and different time zones with the simple act of listening. Now, as the evening settles, allow the room to softly dim around you. Perhaps a fan might hum gently in the background, its consistent, rhythmic presence providing a soothing, almost hypnotic counterpoint to the quiet of the night, a calming presence as we ease into this evening's contemplation together. We will quietly uncover, with a sense of both wonder and perhaps a touch of gentle apprehension, why simply existing, merely surviving for a single day in the sprawling, often unforgiving, wild American frontier might have been an insurmountable task for most, a challenge that few could truly overcome. Imagine, with a soft sigh that acknowledges the burden of the past, you've just stirred from slumber in the American West of the 1870s, the faint light of dawn barely piercing the rough curtains. The slight comfort, a faint glimmer of intellectual intrigue in this thought, is that you are on the very cusp of experiencing a truly pivotal and transformative historical era firsthand, a moment in time that irrevocably reshaped a continent and forged new identities. The less comforting, indeed quite unsettling, truth that settles over you like a cold shroud is that your chances of living through this particular day have just significantly dwindled, slipping away from the moment your eyes began to flutter open, ushering in another chapter of relentless struggle. The very first challenge, a subtle yet pervasive assault on your senses, makes itself undeniably known before your eyes even fully flutter open, a testament to the inescapable realities of the time. It's the scent. Not the fresh, invigorating, earthy aroma one might idyllically associate with untouched nature. The crispness of pine, the dampness of rich soil, but a powerful, somewhat overwhelming, and distinctly unpleasant odor. A lingering, complex combination of unwashed humanity. The distinct pungent tang of animal waste, perpetually present from the many horses and livestock, and quite possibly the acrid, sickening notes of raw sewage, all hanging heavy, stagnant, and inescapable in the air around you, permeating every space. You see, Personal cleanliness was hardly a primary concern, or even a frequent pressing thought in the Old West. Most inhabitants considered a thorough wash, a true scrubbing, a monthly indulgence, a rare and fleeting luxury. And even that, it must be said, is a generous estimate, often an aspirational one. Some would pass entire winters, encased in their worn, grimy clothing, their bodies accumulating layers of dirt and odor, without the benefit of a proper bath, relying on dry wipes at best. Water, as you can imagine, was exceptionally scarce in these parched, often desert-like lands, often painstakingly hauled over great distances, or collected with immense, back-breaking effort from distant wells or dwindling streams. And using it for something as seemingly trivial as washing seemed profoundly wasteful. Even an act of recklessness, when it was so desperately needed for the most fundamental necessities of life, drinking to quench an unquenchable thirst, and preparing the meager meals that sustained precarious existence. As you slowly, perhaps with a soft groan that escapes your lips, pull yourself from your uncomfortable resting place, likely a straw-filled mattress already home to various unseen insects and microscopic life, their presence an unnoticed constant, you become acutely, almost painfully, aware of the deep ache that permeates every one of your muscles, a pervasive soreness that speaks of ceaseless toil. Life in the 1870s frontier demanded ceaseless, back-breaking physical effort, an unrelenting cycle from the first faint, reluctant light of dawn until the very last glimmer of dusk, with no true break. There were no pauses for restorative weekends, no luxurious breaks for vacations, no paid holidays, and certainly no thought given to ergonomic working postures or the long-term well-being of the body, which was seen merely as a tool. Whether your role was that of a stoic farmer, tilling recalcitrant, rocky soil, a grimy miner, extracting precious minerals from the unyielding earth, or a rugged ranch hand tending to vast herds of cattle under an expansive sky, your physical being was your essential, indispensable tool, utilized without question or complaint, pushed to its very limits until it quite literally gave way, collapsing under the strain. You might feel in your contemporary existence that you exert yourself greatly, pushing your limits with exercise or demanding work. But the labor of the frontier was on an entirely different scale, a level of raw exertion that modern minds can scarcely comprehend, a daily grind that wore down even the strongest. It was grueling, unending work that often left even the most robust and strapping individuals stooped, prematurely aged, their bodies bent and gnarled, and suffering from debilitating joint pain by their early 30s, their youth quickly fading. Picture yourself, if you can, spending 14 relentless hours tilling fields under a searing sun, hauling heavy water buckets over long distances, splitting stubborn, knotted wood for fuel, or descending deep into a dark, claustrophobic mine shaft where every breath was dust. It's little wonder, then, that the average life expectancy for these hardy, resilient souls was merely around 35 years, a stark and somber reality, with relatively few living beyond their prime. Standing now on the worn, dusty floor, feeling the grit beneath your feet, a noticeable, pervasive chill permeates the air, seeping into your very bones, raising goosebumps on your skin. Should it be winter, the interior of your humble dwelling, perhaps a rough-hewn cabin with gaps in its walls or a sod house dug into the earth, might hover around 20 degrees below freezing, a numbing, biting cold that offers no true respite, chilling you to the core. If you possessed a hearth, a rudimentary fireplace, you would have permitted its precious embers to die out overnight, a necessary sacrifice to conserve every last scrap of fuel, wood or buffalo chips, knowing how difficult and dangerous it was to procure more. The thought of modern central heating, that ubiquitous comfort taken for granted, or even insulated garments designed for warmth and protection from the cold, would be utterly foreign and unimaginable concepts in this harsh era, luxuries beyond comprehension. And if it's summer, well, be prepared to feel every stitch of your coarse, unwashed attire cling to you with sweat, a constant, uncomfortable dampness that never truly evaporates, leaving you sticky and uncomfortable. There was simply no escaping the relentless, unyielding forces of nature in the Old West. You were exposed, vulnerable, and utterly subject to its every whim, its unpredictable fury. Regarding what one might wear, abandon any fleeting notion of comfort, fashion, or personal expression. Men typically possessed perhaps 2 sets of clothes if they were fortunate enough to own a spare: coarse canvas or denim trousers, stiff, unforgiving, and perpetually stained, and cotton shirts that would chafe relentlessly against the skin with every movement, causing irritation. Women, on the other hand, wore numerous layers, irrespective of the temperature, a societal expectation that prioritized modesty or perhaps protection from the elements over practicality or personal comfort. Undergarments, often restrictive corsets that painfully compress the body, multiple petticoats creating bulk and trapping heat, and lengthy dresses that trailed along the dusty ground, picking up every particle of dirt, every speck of grime. Everything felt abrasive, poorly fitted, and was, to put it mildly, rarely cleansed, carrying the accumulated grime, sweat, and odors of weeks, if not months. A constant reminder of the lack of resources. Those elegant, pristine ensembles, often depicted in cinematic portrayals of the West, with their flowing fabrics, delicate lace, and spotless appearances, pure, unadulterated fantasy for the average inhabitant, a sartorial dream utterly divorced from the grimy, practical reality of frontier life, where durability trumped aesthetics. Your stomach, with a soft, persistent rumbling sound that echoes in the quiet room, emits a gentle cue that it's time for your morning meal, a daily ritual of sustenance. Hopefully, you have a deep, abiding fondness for beans, hard biscuits, and incredibly strong, often bitter, coffee, as these might well be your staples for every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day in and day out, with little variation. The diet of the Old West was notably unvaried, profoundly repetitive, and critically lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread deficiencies and chronic poor health. Fresh produce was a seasonal rarity, a fleeting luxury enjoyed only when crops were bountiful and transport allowed and quickly perishable. Meat, when it could be obtained, was frequently preserved with vast quantities of salt or dense smoke. As refrigeration, that modern miracle of preservation, was an utterly unknown concept, its benefits unimaginable. Scurvy, a debilitating condition resulting from a chronic lack of vitamin C, which manifests as bleeding gums, a general malaise, and the alarming loosening of teeth, was surprisingly prevalent among settlers, despite its easy prevention with current nutritional knowledge, a common affliction. You might assume the coffee, at the very least, would be palatable, a comforting, familiar start to the day. Cinematic cowboys always seem to have a steaming pot simmering over a cheerful fire, but what you would actually be served would barely resemble what you recognize as coffee. It was typically boiled relentlessly for hours on end, becoming incredibly bitter, and often contained crude additives like crushed eggshells or even salt, supposedly to lessen the harshness of the brew, though often making it worse. Still, the jolt of caffeine, however unpalatable or crude, would provide a necessary, if temporary, energy boost to help you confront the demands of the day, to push through the pervasive weariness so you'd consume it without protest. A grim necessity, a fuel for survival. Before venturing outdoors, where new and unknown perils await, it would be exceptionally wise, indeed a matter of ingrained habit for survival, to inspect your footwear for any scorpions or serpents that might have sought refuge during the coolness of the night, seeking warmth and shelter within your boots. A hidden danger. It was a common, indeed vital ritual for frontier dwellers to tap out their boots each morning, vigorously shaking them upside down, a habit born from painful, sometimes deadly, encounters with venomous creatures. One careless misstep, one moment of inattention or forgetfulness, and you could face a venomous bite, miles and miles from any hope of medical assistance, leaving you to succumb to the poison, to suffer agonizing pain, or face a long, agonizing, solitary journey for help that might never arrive. As you tentatively step beyond the threshold of your cabin, pushing open the creaking wooden door, an immediate, pervasive sense of vulnerability washes over you. The vast, sweeping expanses of the American frontier were undeniably breathtaking in their wild, untamed beauty, yet they were equally unyielding, indifferent to human struggle or suffering. Extreme weather could emerge with very little forewarning, transforming a clear blue sky into a raging tempest in mere minutes, catching travelers unaware. Blizzards could descend with terrifying speed, trapping travelers and leading to agonizing deaths from exposure. Swirling tornadoes could materialize from nowhere, devastating entire communities in their path, with no emergency services available to aid survivors amidst the rubble. Sudden flash floods could inundate dry riverbeds, turning a trickling stream into a raging torrent, or prolonged droughts could parch the land to dust, destroying crops and leading to widespread famine, all spelling the end for those unprepared, caught unawares, swept away by nature's fury. The sky might appear deceptively clear in this moment, a placid blue inviting complacency, but that could shift dramatically, violently, within minutes, leaving you exposed and vulnerable. If you've established yourself within the burgeoning confines of a frontier community, a small cluster of buildings huddled together in the vastness, you might imagine that this semblance of civilization offers a welcome degree of security, a fragile shield against the immediate dangers of the wilderness. In certain respects, this holds true. The immediate dangers of wild animals or getting lost in the wilderness are diminished within town limits. In others, however, it merely introduces different, often insidious perils. Dangers of a more human or microscopic nature. Towns in the Old West were veritable breeding grounds for illness, hotbeds of contagion. Lacking proper waste disposal systems, with human and animal waste often left to accumulate in the streets, or any scientific understanding of how germs operated and spread, diseases disseminated swiftly and mercilessly through these crowded, unsanitary settlements. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were ever-present dangers, lurking in every corner, carried on every breath, a constant threat to public health. A widespread illness, an epidemic, could decimate half a town in mere weeks, leaving behind a trail of grief, empty homes, and shattered lives. Speaking of towns, let's imagine you decide to venture into one today, perhaps to procure supplies, gather news, or simply to witness the bustle of human activity, a rare respite from solitude. As you draw near, a faint outline on the horizon, you observe a distinct absence of the orderly, planned arrangement you might anticipate from a modern settlement. Many Western communities grew in a rather haphazard, organic fashion, with structures erected wherever it seemed convenient or profitable. often without any semblance of foresight, foundational planning, or municipal zoning, a chaotic sprawl. The pathways are not paved, but are instead dirt tracks, deeply rutted and uneven from countless wagons and hooves, that transform into thick, impassable, muddy quagmires after even a light rain, trapping wagons, and dusty, choking expanses when dry, kicked up by every passing foot or hoof, filling the air with fine particles. The odor, that omnipresent frontier scent, assaults your senses once more, now even more potent and concentrated within the confines of the settlement. Horse manure is pervasive, an unavoidable constant, given that horses served as the primary, indeed almost exclusive, mode of transportation and labor, their waste accumulating everywhere. There are no public sanitation services, no dedicated street cleaners, no garbage collection to speak of, so refuse simply piled up. In some particularly busy sections, the accumulated refuse, the discarded detritus of human and animal life, could reach knee-deep proportions, a vile carpet of filth. Swarms of flies buzz around you, a constant irritating companion, landing on everything, and you grasp with chilling clarity why ailments propagate with such ease and rapidity here. Why disease is an ever-present specter, a silent killer in the crowded streets. As you stroll along the main thoroughfare, navigating the uneven terrain and avoiding puddles or piles of waste, you pass the local establishment, often referred to as a saloon, likely one of the most bustling and lively places in the settlement, a center of social activity. Contrary to what romanticized cinematic portrayals might suggest, these venues were not glamorous spaces with grand, inviting swinging doors and lively, melodic piano music, sophisticated and refined. Most were simple, often crude, single-room structures with rough, unvarnished wooden counters and basic, uncomfortable seating, serving a raw clientele. The spirits served were not finely aged, smooth beverages, but raw, potent, often illegally distilled alcohol, frequently blended with unsettling additives like tobacco juice, fiery pepper, harsh turpentine, or even, alarmingly, gunpowder, all intended to provide an extra, brutal jolt to give it a kick. A single measure, if you were particularly unlucky, or the concoction was especially potent, could, in rare cases, result in permanent blindness, a tragic and irreversible consequence of frontier drinking. This establishment, the saloon, embodies another perilous facet of frontier existence, the ever-present threat of violence. These locations were frequent scenes of fatal clashes, not from formal duels or planned, honorable confrontations with strict rules, but from intoxicated arguments that rapidly escalated in a populace heavily armed and prone to impulsive, alcohol-fueled actions. The romanticized gun battles of Western cinema, the image of two opponents facing off at high noon in a dramatic showdown, were exceedingly uncommon. Most violence was spontaneous, chaotic, and stemmed from trivial disagreements, fueled by alcohol and simmering tensions, erupting without warning. Regarding carrying arms as you continue your observations, you'll observe that nearly everyone, men and women alike, bears some form of weapon, though perhaps not for the sensationalized reasons you might assume from popular fiction. While personal defense was certainly a vital consideration, a necessity in a lawless land, weapons were predominantly practical tools. For hunting wild game to put food on the table, for safeguarding against predatory wild animals that roamed freely, and occasionally for signaling or communication in emergencies. The persistent danger from bears, wolves, elusive mountain cats, and venomous snakes made venturing unarmed unwise, indeed reckless, particularly when journeying between communities or out into the vast open wilderness. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier settlements actually had stringent regulations concerning firearms. Places such as Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, for instance, mandated that visitors relinquish their weapons upon entering town limits, requiring them to be checked at the marshal's office to prevent violence. The well-known confrontation at the OK Corral actually began because a group refused to abide by Tombstone's weapon ordinance, not from a challenge of honor or a personal vendetta. Despite what you may have witnessed in films, rapid-draw duels in the middle of a dusty street were exceedingly rare, almost mythical occurrences. Most shootings were ambushes, acts of robbery, or occurred during moments of extreme anger and heated confrontation. The image of the skilled marksman facing an adversary at midday, a paragon of cool resolve and honorable conduct, is largely a charming but misleading construct of entertainment. Actual frontier violence was typically abrupt, disordered, and entirely devoid of any sense of honor or fairness, often occurring in dark alleys or crowded places without warning. As you continue your stroll past the raucous saloon and its clamor, you pass the local medical practitioner's office, identified perhaps by a simple, crudely painted sign depicting a mortar and pestle or a barber's pole. Healthcare on the 1870s frontier would be profoundly shocking, even horrifying, to your contemporary sensibilities, a stark reminder of how far medical science has come. Most medical professionals had scant, if any, formal education. Many were self-proclaimed doctors who learned through trial and error, from outdated texts, or simply by observing others, often with disastrous results. Surgical procedures were conducted without any form of pain relief beyond crude alcohol or opium-based morphine, leaving patients fully conscious and suffering. And sterile practices were virtually non-existent, leading to rampant, often fatal infections. Something as seemingly minor as an infected wound from a splinter or a scrape could result in amputation, a desperate measure to save a life, or swift fatality from blood poisoning. Common remedies included bloodletting, the belief that illness was caused by bad blood that needed to be drained, and compounds containing mercury, arsenic, and other harmful substances that often inflicted more damage than benefit, slowly poisoning the patient and exacerbating their condition. Women enduring childbirth in remote areas faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4, a terrifyingly high risk for a universal human experience. Dental care involved excruciating extractions performed without anesthesia, using crude implements like pliers or blacksmith's tongs, the pain unbearable. Most individuals endured agonizing dental problems, rotting teeth, and persistent pain for years before eventually losing their teeth entirely, their mouths a mess of decay. If you suffered an injury or fell gravely ill on the frontier, your continued existence frequently relied more on sheer blind fortune and a robust constitution than on any effective medical intervention, a testament to the limited knowledge of the time. Even slight injuries, a twisted ankle or a deep cut, could become life-threatening due to overwhelming infection, a constant invisible menace. Fractured bones might never heal correctly, leaving frontier residents with persistent discomfort, debilitating pain, and significant physical limitations for the remainder of their shortened, often laborious lives. The well-known saying, "Only the robust survive," held a very literal, indeed brutal truth in the Old West, a daily winnowing of the weak. Your stomach rumbles once more, a hollow echo in the quiet afternoon, signaling that it's time for your midday meal. You make your way to the local eating establishment, which is likely just an extension of someone's dwelling, where meals are offered for a charge. Perhaps a boarding house sign hangs outside, or a crude eats painted on a board. The fare is no more varied or appealing than your morning repast. Meat is tough, often stringy, and frequently past its prime, despite extensive smoking or salting, as refrigeration was, again, an unknown concept. Its benefits unimaginable. Vegetables, if obtainable at all, are cooked to a soft, mushy consistency, their nutrients boiled away, flavorless and unappealing. Standards for food hygiene are non-existent, so digestive ailments and food poisoning are common occurrences. A frequent and unpleasant part of daily life, causing widespread sickness as you consume your meal, likely in silence or amidst the sparse chatter of other diners. You might overhear conversations about recent conflicts, the movements of notorious gangs of outlaws, or the ever-present perils of solitary travel across the vast, empty landscapes. While instances of violence against settlers by indigenous peoples were far less frequent than commonly depicted in later, often biased accounts, in reality, settlers and the military were more often the aggressors, encroaching on lands and breaking treaties with disregard. Nevertheless, the frontier remained a place of contention, a landscape marked by simmering tensions, a constant struggle for land and resources. The systematic displacement of native populations, a tragic chapter in history, led to conflicts that sometimes erupted into violence on all sides, a desperate struggle for survival and sovereignty. As for outlaws, they posed a genuine and terrifying threat, particularly in isolated regions where law was a distant concept, a word without meaning. Law enforcement was scarce, stretched thin, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for an area spanning thousands of square miles, rendering any semblance of regular patrolling or swift responses impossible. In many locales, justice was meted out through informal community actions, often harsh and swift, rather than formal legal processes. Vigilante groups formed, taking the law into their own hands, and lynchings were not uncommon. A brutal display of frontier justice, and the principle of presumed innocence was often disregarded in favor of mob rule, accusation often equating to guilt. If you were accused of stealing horses or cattle, crime considered particularly heinous on the frontier, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before the sunset, regardless of your actual culpability, your fate sealed by accusation alone, with no chance for a fair trial. After your meal, with a sense of quiet determination and a growing awareness of your precarious situation, you decide to visit the local general store to replenish your dwindling supplies, a place where all necessities could be found. The costs are astonishing, a stark reminder of the economic realities of frontier life. Basic necessities are far more expensive on the frontier than back east, due to the immense challenges and high cost of transporting goods over vast, often dangerous distances. A simple canned fruit, a rare treat that speaks of civilization, might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's currency, an exorbitant price for a small indulgence. Many settlers spent the majority of their meager income on essential items, leaving little for comfort or any semblance of luxury, perpetually living hand-to-mouth. The store, despite its meager offerings, provides another poignant glimpse into frontier life, the profound, soul-crushing isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent, unreliable, and often weeks or months behind schedule, making communication a frustrating ordeal. Newspapers could be weeks or even months out of date, making current events a distant memory, irrelevant by the time they arrived. Information traveled at a snail's pace, a frustratingly slow trickle, and you might go years without any news from family residing back east, simply wondering if they were alive and well, their fates unknown. Many pioneers never saw their relatives again after relocating westward, a permanent severing of ties, a deep and enduring emotional cost. The emotional burden of this solitude, this deep separation from loved ones and familiar ways, contributed to elevated rates of despair, alcohol dependency, and self-harm among frontier communities, a silent suffering often overlooked in the grand narratives. As the afternoon progresses, the sky begins to change, subtly at first, then more dramatically, and you notice ominous clouds gathering on the horizon, a subtle darkening that portends danger. Weather on the frontier was not merely uncomfortable, it could be lethal, a force of nature that demanded respect, a constant, unpredictable threat. Without modern forecasting, without warning systems, storms arrived with minimal warning, descending abruptly and violently. Blizzards could descend with terrifying speed, trapping travelers, leading to agonizing deaths from exposure, their bodies succumbing to the cold. Swirling tornadoes, like destructive funnels, could materialize from nowhere, devastating entire communities in minutes with no emergency services available to aid survivors amidst the rubble. Sudden flash floods could inundate dry riverbeds, turning a trickling stream into a raging torrent that swept away wagon trains. Or prolonged droughts could parch the land to dust, destroying crops and leading to widespread famine, all spelling the end for those unprepared, caught unawares, swept away by nature's fury. Even if you were fortunate enough to possess a proper dwelling, it offered only limited protection from the elements. Most frontier homes were constructed hastily from whatever materials were at hand, often lacking proper insulation or sturdy foundations, vulnerable to the slightest storm. Earth-dug homes on the plains, timber cabins in forested areas, or rudimentary wooden structures in towns, none were particularly effective against severe weather. Winter temperatures inside could fall below freezing, an unbearable cold that seeped into every bone, and summer heat was often unbearable, especially in upper levels where many would sleep, stifling and oppressive, making sleep elusive. As the storm draws nearer, its presence more palpable, the wind picking up, you decide to hasten back to your cabin before it breaks in its full fury. On your way, you pass a group of individuals, their faces grim and determined, heading towards the local mine for another shift of arduous, dangerous work. Mining was among the most hazardous occupations on the frontier, a daily gamble with life itself, a brutal trade. Underground collapses, exposure to noxious invisible fumes, explosions from carelessly handled blasting materials, and machinery mishaps claimed countless existences, leaving behind shattered families and a legacy of tragedy. Miners also suffered from enduring debilitating health conditions such as painful lung disease from inhaling coal dust or insidious mercury poisoning from the gold refinement process, slowly succumbing to their ailments, their bodies ravaged by their labor. Even if you managed to avoid mining, few frontier professions were truly safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment devoid of any safety features, leading to frequent, often severe accidents. Ranching meant interacting with unpredictable, powerful animals weighing hundreds of pounds, always a risk of being trampled or gored. Logging, with its falling trees, heavy machinery, and treacherous terrain, held one of the highest fatality rates of any occupation, a truly deadly calling. Whatever your means of livelihood, your risk of severe injury or death was immeasurably greater than in the contemporary world, a constant shadow lurking over every endeavor. You reach your dwelling, just as the rain begins to descend in earnest, a steady drumming against the roof that quickly intensifies. The roof, however, shows several points of leakage, and you hastily arrange containers, buckets, pots, anything that can hold water, to collect the dripping water, a precious commodity. This presents a timely chance to replenish your drinking supply, as fresh, clean water was scarce and highly valued. Many frontier residents drew from the same sources used for washing clothes and watering livestock, leading to rampant waterborne illnesses that could swiftly prove fatal, spreading through communities like wildfire, a silent epidemic. As you sit within your permeable shelter, listening to the rain's rhythmic patter, the soothing sound a stark contrast to the harsh reality, you quietly reflect on how profoundly different this reality is from the romanticized image of the Old West you once held. There were no grand, clear-cut heroes or definitive villains, simply ordinary individuals striving with immense fortitude to persevere amidst incredibly harsh, unforgiving conditions, their daily struggles unacknowledged by history. The mere fact that anyone managed to endure, to carve out a life, is a profound testament to the enduring human spirit and unwavering resolve, a silent triumph over adversity. Night descends early, with a swiftness that might surprise you, as electricity, that constant source of light, is absent from this era. Candles and oil lamps offer only dim, flickering illumination, casting long, dancing shadows that distort familiar shapes, and you handle them with extreme caution, aware of the ever-present danger. Fire posed a constant, terrifying threat in frontier homes, built often of dry wood and heated by open flames. A single errant spark, a moment of inattention, could mean the loss of everything: your home, your possessions, your very life. With no fire services to summon for aid, no brigade to rush to your rescue, only the helpless screams of neighbors. Many communities were consumed by flames at least once in their history, rising from the ashes only to risk it all again, a cycle of destruction and rebuilding. You prepare for rest, utterly spent from just a single grueling day in the Old West. Your muscles ache with a deep, pervasive weariness. Your stomach feels uneasy from the unfamiliar, often unpleasant sustenance, and your mind is overwhelmed by the perpetual alertness demanded for mere survival, the constant vigilance against unseen perils that lurk in the shadows. As you gradually succumb to slumber, a heavy cloak descending, a haunting question lingers in the quiet darkness, whispering in your ear. Will you awaken tomorrow, or will you merely become another silent statistic in the perilous narrative of the American frontier, your brief existence marked only by a forgotten, unmarked grave? Your story untold? The wind outside your humble dwelling whispers, a haunting, melancholic echo of how small and vulnerable human beings are against the boundless, untamed wilderness, a reminder of your fragility. Tomorrow, if you are fortunate enough to witness its dawn, will usher in all these same challenges, these familiar struggles, alongside new ones you haven't yet conceived, new trials to test your limits, new dangers to navigate. In the Old West, survival was never assured. It was a daily, hourly struggle, a constant battle, earned through difficulties that most modern individuals can barely begin to fathom, let alone endure with such steadfastness. The initial, faint glow of morning light seeps through the tiny cracks in your cabin walls, a fragile promise of a new day, gently rousing you from a restless, uneasy sleep, punctuated by strange dreams. Your body protests from the unforgiving mattress, every joint and muscle aching with renewed intensity. Yet there is no time for lingering, no indulgence in rest. The Old West observes no delays, tolerates no weakness, demanding constant effort. As you reluctantly rise, pushing yourself upright, yesterday's harsh, unvarnished introduction to frontier existence returns to your thoughts with chilling clarity, and you ponder, with a sense of quiet dread and reluctant resolve, what new trials, what fresh tribulations this new day might bring forth from the vast unknown. Let us imagine you decide to depart from the town today with a renewed, though perhaps tentative, sense of purpose, embarking on a journey across the vast, often featureless frontier. Whether your destination is another distant settlement, joining a westward-bound caravan, or simply exploring the wild expanses, travel in the 1870s was a vastly different undertaking, a monumental challenge compared to what you are accustomed to in your modern world of paved roads and rapid transport. The encouraging news, a faint beacon of progress, is that by this period, the Transcontinental Railway had been finished, a monumental engineering feat, finally linking the eastern and western coasts and revolutionizing travel. The less fortunate reality, however, is that unless you possessed considerable wealth or were traveling between major cities with railway access, using it would likely be beyond your means, an unattainable luxury reserved for the few. Most frontier inhabitants journeyed by horse, if they were lucky enough to own one, by slow, lumbering wagon, or simply, painstakingly, on foot, covering vast distances step by agonizing step. If you owned a horse, consider yourself quite fortunate, indeed privileged, as it represented a significant asset and means of mobility. Horses were costly to acquire and maintain, rendering them inaccessible to many settlers who struggled for basic survival. A robust, healthy horse could command the equivalent of several months' earnings for an average laborer, a truly significant investment for a frontier family. Then came the additional expense of saddles, bridles, feed, and, if available, veterinary attention, which was rare and costly. Though often, veterinary care meant dispatching the animal if it broke a leg or contracted certain incurable ailments, a harsh practicality of frontier economics. Riding itself was no leisurely excursion, no joyful gallop across open fields, as depicted in dime novels. Saddles in the 1870s were designed for practicality, for holding a rider securely during long journeys, not for comfort, often lacking padding or ergonomic design. Hours spent astride left even seasoned riders with painful sores, raw chafing, and deeply aching muscles, a constant discomfort. And if your horse startled at a snake slithering across the path or an abrupt, unexpected sound, a frequent occurrence in the wild, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones, a concussion, or worse, miles from any assistance, left alone to face the consequences in the vast wilderness. If acquiring a horse was not financially possible, or if your family's possessions necessitated it, you might journey by wagon. Dismiss the idyllic, often misleading image of pioneers cheerfully traversing pristine landscapes in comfortable covered wagons, singing hymns. Wagon travel was agonizingly uncomfortable, a torturous experience of constant jarring and jolting. The vehicles possessed no shock absorption beyond the slight, minimal flexibility of wooden wheels and simple leaf springs, meaning you felt every single stone, rut, and hollow in the path with bone-jarring intensity. Every bump a jolt to your spine. The constant jarring induced a sensation akin to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous, disoriented, and profoundly miserable, unable to find comfort. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt trails, carved by those who came before, often barely discernible, winding through the landscape. After rain, they became thick, impassable muddy bogs, where wagons could sink axle deep, becoming hopelessly stuck for days, requiring immense effort to free them. During dry periods, the dust was so dense it was difficult to breathe or see, choking lungs and obscuring vision, covering everything in a fine layer of grit. Wagons frequently broke down, with wheels cracking or axles snapping under the strain, leaving travelers stranded miles from the nearest settlement, forced to undertake arduous repairs with limited tools and even more limited expertise. Let's suppose, with a sense of bold adventure and perhaps a naive optimism, you have decided to undertake the extensive journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train, heading west along the renowned Oregon Trail, a legendary but perilous route, a path paved with dreams and despair. This 2,000-mile expedition was among the most perilous endeavors of the 19th century, a true test of human endurance and will. Of the approximately 400,000 individuals who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 did not survive the arduous trek, perishing along the way, their dreams left unfinished. The Oregon Trail was sometimes referred to, grimly, as the nation's longest burial ground, a testament to the lives lost along its brutal length. Some historical accounts estimate that, on average, 10 to 15 people perished for every mile of the trail, a chilling statistic that paints a stark picture. Consider that. A grave approximately every 350 feet for 2,000 miles. A continuous line of unmarked resting places. A somber procession. The trail was dotted with makeshift grave markers, often simple wooden crosses or piles of stones, many without names, as families were compelled to enter loved ones quickly and immediately, resume their arduous trek, unable to linger in their grief, lest they fall behind and face even greater perils. Illness was the foremost cause of death on the Oregon Trail, a silent, relentless killer that claimed more lives than any other factor. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water and unsanitary conditions, was particularly devastating, sweeping through wagon trains with terrifying speed, leaving little time for preparation or escape. This dreadful ailment caused severe dehydration, uncontrollable diarrhea, and relentless vomiting, depleting the body's fluids so rapidly that a person could be seemingly well at breakfast and tragically deceased by dinner, their life extinguished in mere hours. There was no effective remedy available, no antidote, no understanding of its cause or cure. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of individuals in a single cholera outbreak, their numbers dwindling with terrifying rapidity, leaving survivors to carry the dead and the burden of grief. Other rampant illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and various fevers, often grouped under mountain fever, claimed countless lives, their names lost to history. Children were especially susceptible, their fragile immune systems no match for the diseases, with many families losing multiple offspring during the journey, a heartbreaking reality that shattered countless hopes. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often comprising folk remedies that offered little genuine assistance and sometimes, tragically, exacerbated conditions, unknowingly doing more harm than good. Cruising rivers presented another formidable, often terrifying obstacle that challenged the ingenuity and courage of the pioneers. Wagons were not designed to float, a fundamental design flaw for a journey that required numerous water crossings. Yet pioneers had to traverse countless waterways on their westward journey, rivers that could be wide, deep, and treacherous. Some crossings had ferries, if you were lucky enough to find one and afford the fee, or shallow areas that were less treacherous, offering a glimmer of safety. But many necessitated unyoking the animals and floating the wagon across like a makeshift vessel, a perilous undertaking that often involved dismantling and reassembling the wagon on the other side. Wagons frequently overturned during these crossings, capsizing in the currents, drowning individuals and precious livestock, and destroying invaluable provisions, leaving families destitute and desperate, their livelihoods swept away. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers alone, with their powerful currents and unpredictable depths, claimed hundreds of lives during this migratory period, their waters concealing countless tragedies and untold stories of loss. Contrary to popular, sensationalized belief, often fueled by later fiction, encounters with violence from native populations were relatively infrequent, often exaggerated in later narratives to justify conquest. Most indigenous groups were, in fact, helpful to migrants, offering provisions, valuable guidance on routes, and aid with difficult river crossings, demonstrating hospitality, wisdom, and a willingness to coexist. The majority of violent deaths on the trail resulted from accidents, being crushed by heavy wagon wheels, a constant danger, drowning in treacherous rivers, or being kicked by draft animals, powerful and unpredictable creatures. Firearm accidents were surprisingly common, a grim irony, as most travelers were unfamiliar with handling weapons, yet carried them for hunting and protection, leading to tragic misfires and accidental shootings, often self-inflicted. The psychological toll of the journey was immense, a burden on the human spirit that scarred many souls. Families buried their children, their parents, and their spouses along the way, their grief profound, then had to continue traveling immediately, driven by the relentless need to reach their destination. There was no time for prolonged grieving on the trail, no space for true mourning, only the imperative to move forward. Each day's delay lessened the chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows rendered the passes impassable, a chilling deadline that drove them onward. The constant stress, the profound sorrow, and the crushing physical hardship led many travelers to mental collapse, their minds breaking under the strain of unrelenting adversity. Suicide was not unheard of among those on the trail, a desperate escape from unimaginable suffering, a silent tragedy amidst the vast landscape. If you somehow managed, against all odds, to complete the grueling journey to California or Oregon, your trials were, regrettably, not over, as the destination brought its own set of challenges. Many arrived at their destination having depleted all their funds and precious resources on the journey itself, arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a weary spirit. Families often arrived impoverished, undernourished, and unwell, only to discover that the promised land, the verdant paradise they had envisioned, held its own harsh realities and new struggles, often as difficult as the journey itself. But let's imagine you've chosen not to travel such a great, perilous distance. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town, or a small, isolated settlement instead. A shorter journey, but still fraught with risk. Even short excursions in the Old West presented considerable dangers, a constant awareness of lurking threats. Travelers might encounter outlaws who viewed solitary riders or small groups as easy targets, opportunities for plunder and violence. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was amplified and romanticized in later stories, they did occur regularly enough to be a genuine worry, a constant threat on isolated roads and trails. The natural world itself posed constant, unpredictable threats to those journeying. Flash floods could wash out paths or trap unsuspecting travelers in sudden deluges. Summer heat in desert regions could lead to agonizing death from dehydration and sunstroke, the sun beating down mercilessly on unprotected bodies. Winter blizzards routinely marooned travelers, sometimes resulting in deaths from freezing exposure or forcing desperate measures for survival, such as consuming one's own animals. Navigation itself was a profound challenge in an era before detailed maps and GPS. Travelers relied on imprecise directions, vague landmarks that could alter or be misidentified, and the expertise of guides who sometimes proved unreliable or opportunistic. leading them astray. Becoming lost in the vast, undifferentiated wilderness could be a death sentence, particularly if your provisions ran low and help was nowhere in sight. As you traverse the landscape today, whether by horse, wagon, or on foot, the sun slowly arcing across the wide sky, you observe another aspect of frontier existence that cinematic depictions often overlook or simplify: the remarkable, vibrant diversity of its people. The Old West was not exclusively populated by individuals of European descent, as often portrayed. It was a dynamic convergence of cultures from across the globe, a true melting pot of races and ethnicities. Chinese immigrants, driven by the promise of opportunity or escape from hardship, labored tirelessly as railway builders, miners, and traders, contributing immensely to the infrastructure and economy. Mexican families had inhabited the Southwest, cultivating the land and establishing communities. Long before it became part of the United States, their heritage deeply rooted. Black individuals, seeking freedom and opportunity after emancipation, comprised as much as a quarter of the workforce on certain ranches, becoming skilled cowboys and laborers, defying prejudice. European immigrants from various nations, Irish, German, Italian, Scandinavian, contributed their traditions, languages, and labor, adding to the rich tapestry. And of course, countless distinct indigenous nations had called these lands home for millennia before the arrival of others, their histories deeply interwoven with the landscape, their presence integral. This rich tapestry of cultures, however, did not automatically translate into equity, harmony, or peaceful coexistence. Conflict rooted in racial prejudice was a prevalent, deeply disturbing feature of frontier life, a constant undercurrent of injustice and animosity. Chinese railway workers endured brutal discrimination, often subjected to violence and exploitation, and were frequently assigned the most dangerous tasks for less remuneration than their white counterparts, their lives deemed expendable. Mexican landowners, whose families had held land for generations, frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War, dispossessed of their heritage and livelihoods. Black Americans who migrated westward, hoping to escape the overt discrimination and violence in the South, often encountered equally ingrained, though perhaps different in form, prejudice on the frontier, finding that true freedom and equality were often elusive, a mirage. Despite their vital, undeniable contributions to ranching, mining, and the development of frontier communities, they were often excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance, facing persistent barriers and systemic injustice. For indigenous peoples, the relentless expansion of European settlement was nothing short of a catastrophe, a cataclysmic disruption of their way of life and culture. The native population of North America, once estimated at perhaps 15 million, had dwindled to fewer than 300,000 by 1900, a devastating demographic decline unprecedented in scope. Disease, for which they had no immunity, warfare, forced relocation from their ancestral lands, and the deliberate, systematic destruction of their food sources, especially the bison, decimated numerous tribes and nations, eroding their very existence and cultural foundations. Government policies systematically pushed indigenous Americans from their ancestral lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and limited resources, making self-sufficiency nearly impossible, fostering dependency. Treaties, solemnly signed agreements intended to ensure peace and land rights, were routinely violated by the government when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands, betraying trust and leading to further conflict. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to erase their cultural identity, to civilize them. A cruel form of cultural genocide that inflicted deep wounds. The romanticized portrayals of conflict between cowboys and native populations in later films grossly misrepresented the intricate, often tragic, interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples, simplifying a complex history of dispossession and resistance. Many native nations initially sought to adapt to changing circumstances and accommodate newcomers, demonstrating remarkable resilience and a willingness to coexist. Violence typically erupted after repeated breaches of treaties, relentless encroachment on tribal territories, or deliberate provocations by settlers and the military, often in self-defense against overwhelming force. As you continue your journey, your thoughts might drift to another group whose experiences markedly diverged from cinematic depictions, women on the frontier. Far from the helpless figures or simple, demure school teachers of Western films, frontier women performed incredibly strenuous physical labor while navigating restrictive societal expectations, enduring a double burden of physical and social demands. On homesteads and farms, women not only managed traditional household duties, such as cooking over open fires, arduous cleaning, relentless child rearing, and garment making from scratch, a ceaseless cycle of domestic labor, but also toiled in the fields, cared for livestock, and defended the home with courage when necessary, facing dangers alongside men. Their workday typically commenced before dawn and concluded long after dark, with very few, if any, days of respite, a tireless existence. A frontier woman might be expected to plow fields in the morning, assist with a neighbor's childbirth at midday, ward off predators threatening livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout the evening. A seemingly impossible list of responsibilities that speaks to incredible resilience. Many women became widows at a young age due to the hazardous nature of frontier life, and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising their children, demonstrating extraordinary strength and independence. Despite their essential, undeniable contributions to the development of the West, women possessed limited legal rights. In most territories and states, they could not vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children. In the event of divorce, their legal existence often subsumed by their husbands, leaving them vulnerable. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, with little legal recourse available to victims, leaving them unprotected and isolated. For unmarried women, options were severely constrained. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts, and were often expected to resign upon marriage, effectively ending their careers. Some women found financial independence by operating boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing businesses related to hats or dressmaking, carving out their own niches in a male-dominated world. Then there were the soiled doves, women working in frontier brothels and saloons, often stigmatized and ostracized. While later myths romanticized these women, depicting them as glamorous or defiant, the reality was typically bleak and exploitative. Many entered the profession out of economic desperation, after being widowed, abandoned, or lured by false promises. Physical abuse, substance dependency, and sexually transmitted diseases were common occupational hazards, leading to short, difficult lives. Yet, paradoxically, some women did experience greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The scarcity of women in Western territories often offered them more marital choices and sometimes better treatment as communities competed to attract and retain female residents, recognizing their value. A few territories, such as Wyoming and Utah, granted women voting rights decades before the National Amendment, a progressive step that acknowledged their vital contributions to frontier development and their capacity for civic engagement. As the day continues and you press on with your travels, the sun slowly arcing across the wide sky, you might ponder the nature of law enforcement in this supposedly lawless territory, a concept often romanticized in fiction. The truth was intricate and varied considerably by location. Larger cities and towns typically possessed some form of organized law enforcement, such as a town marshal or a small sheriff's office. But vast rural expanses had minimal, if any, official protection, leaving residents to largely fend for themselves. County sheriffs were elected officials tasked with maintaining order across territories that were sometimes enormous, encompassing thousands of square miles. A single sheriff might be the sole law enforcement officer for such a vast area, rendering regular patrols or swift responses impossible, relying on luck. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, forming posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence, often relying on untrained volunteers. Town marshals managed law enforcement within town boundaries, occasionally with a few deputies in larger settlements, but their authority rarely extended beyond city limits. These roles were often perilous and poorly compensated, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants who genuinely sought to uphold justice and those who relished the authority the badge conferred, sometimes abusing it. Some well-known lawmen, whose names echo through history, moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable ventures throughout their careers, blurring the lines between law and lawlessness. Federal marshals held jurisdiction throughout territories and states, but their numbers were few and their scope limited. They typically focused on significant crimes such as counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses spanning multiple jurisdictions, leaving local crimes to local, often non-existent authorities. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western films, single-handedly bringing order to chaotic towns with their quick wits and quicker draws, were largely fictionalized creations, grander than the reality. In many remote areas, far from any established legal system, justice was administered through informal community action rather than official legal procedures. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective, taking the law into their own hands. Sometimes these groups maintained a basic level of order, providing a rough form of justice, but they could easily transform into instruments for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence, becoming as dangerous as the criminals they pursued, a perversion of justice. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight, a staple of Westerns, was largely a later invention, a dramatic flourish designed for entertainment. Most frontier violence was ordinary, impulsive, and often fueled by alcohol. Brawls that escalated to fatal levels, domestic disputes and arguments over land boundaries or stolen livestock were far more common than dramatic choreographed shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal punishment was severe by contemporary standards. Hanging was the customary penalty for murder, assault, and sometimes even theft, particularly of horses or cattle, which were considered vital assets and were often the difference between survival and starvation. Prisons existed, but were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and deplorable conditions. Many communities favored immediate execution over the expense and burden of long-term incarceration. As evening approaches, the sun dipping below the distant horizon, casting long shadows, you decide to seek refuge for the night, a brief reprieve from the day's hardships. If fortune smiles upon you, you might discover a town with a hotel or a boarding house, a rare oasis of shelter in the vastness. Do not anticipate lavishness or modern amenities. Frontier accommodations were, at best, rudimentary, offering only the barest necessities. A typical room would feature a simple cot, possibly infested with small insects that would bite through the night, a washstand with a pitcher and basin for a cursory wash, and perhaps a single rickety chair. Restroom facilities would be an outhouse located at the rear of the building, shared by all guests, and offering little privacy or hygiene. Privacy was minimal, with thin walls allowing you to hear every sound and conversation from your neighbors, their snores, their whispers, their arguments. In more bustling establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize capacity during busy periods and to cut costs for travelers. The linens, if they existed, might not have been refreshed for previous occupants, and lighting would be limited to candles or dim oil lamps, casting an intimate glow. A night's lodging would typically cost between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location, and the availability of rooms. This represented a significant outlay for many travelers, equivalent to several hours of wages for an average laborer, a hefty sum for a night's sleep. Many opted to sleep in stables, barns, or simply beneath the open sky, exposed to the elements, to conserve precious funds. Despite the additional perils these choices presented, if your travels took you through more remote, uninhabited regions, far from any settlements, you would likely establish a campsite for the night. This entailed the arduous task of building a fire, assuming you could locate sufficient fuel in the vastness, preparing a meager meal from your limited provisions, and sleeping on the hard ground with minimal protection from the elements or curious wildlife. Indigenous peoples, seasoned travelers, and military scouts possessed sophisticated methods for safe camping, passed down through generations, their knowledge vital for survival. However, the average settler often made dangerous errors due to inexperience. Proper fire management was literally a matter of life and death. A fire built too large could ignite a prairie or forest fire that could consume vast areas in hours, spreading destruction and claiming lives. One built too small might not provide enough warmth during cold nights, leading to hypothermia and frostbite, a slow, agonizing death. Campfire cooking demanded skills most modern individuals lack, often resulting in meals that were simultaneously charred on the outside and undercooked on the inside, a culinary challenge. As night fully descends and you prepare for sleep, the profound sounds of the frontier darkness envelop you, a symphony of wildness that is both captivating and terrifying. Coyotes vocalize in the distance, their eerie calls echoing across the plains. Unfamiliar birds call out from unseen perches. The wind whispers through the tall grasses or rustles through tree branches, a constant murmuring presence that sounds like voices for those accustomed to contemporary light pollution and constant noise. The profound silence and strange, often unnerving, nocturnal sounds of the wilderness often provoked intense anxiety, a feeling of unease in the face of the unknown and unseen. Many travelers on the frontier experienced restless sleep, not solely due to physical discomfort, but from apprehension of the unseen dangers that might lurk in the darkness, a constant vigilance. Predator attacks, though statistically rare, frequently occurred at dawn when sleepers were most vulnerable, their senses dulled by sleep. Animals such as wolves, bears, and mountain lions might investigate camps in search of food, their shadows moving silently through the night. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought warm places to rest, sometimes including a person's sleeping roll, a terrifying discovery upon waking. Even if no actual threats materialized, the psychological burden of constant vigilance, the awareness of being utterly alone and exposed, took its toll, eroding mental well-being and leading to chronic fatigue. Frontier journals often mention exhaustion, not merely from physical exertion, but from the relentless mental strain of perpetual alertness, a weariness that seeped into the soul. Modern individuals accustomed to secure doors, advanced alarm systems, and the comforting safety of densely populated areas would find the vulnerability of frontier sleeping arrangements deeply unsettling, a primal fear awakened by the wild. As you drift towards sleep, your mind still racing with the day's events, you reflect on the day's journey, a profound, exhausting experience that has tested your limits. Travel in the Old West bore almost no resemblance to its sanitized, idealized portrayal in later entertainment, with its cheerful tunes and picturesque scenery. It was arduous, hazardous, and uncomfortable beyond what most contemporary individuals could endure, a constant test of resilience. The necessary skills, from navigating without maps or reliable guidance to making emergency repairs on broken wagons and safely handling firearms in a crisis, required years to develop, and errors were often swift and fatal, with no room for mistakes. The darkness deepens, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures grow louder, a constant reminder of the wild world around you. Tomorrow, we'll introduce new challenges, new tests of your resolve, new dangers to navigate. If you survive the night, perhaps you will reach your destination, or perhaps you will become just another unmarked burial along the path. One more silent statistic in the perilous chronicle of westward expansion. Your story untold, your dreams unfulfilled. The Old West pardoned no frailty, showed no mercy, and offered no second chances. Each day survived was a triumph against overwhelming odds, a silent, personal victory, a testament to enduring courage. The new day breaks upon the frontier, a faint, growing light on the eastern horizon, painting the sky with soft hues, and somehow, against all the odds, against the pervasive dangers, you have endured the night. A quiet, profound victory in itself in the unforgiving Old West, a testament to your unacknowledged resilience. As you gently rub the last vestiges of sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching frame, every muscle protesting with renewed intensity, you contemplate what path your frontier experience might take next, what new challenges this vast land will present. Today, perhaps, you will try your fortune in one of the burgeoning mining towns, their names echoing with promise: Deadwood, Goldfield, Silver City, where wealth is supposedly accumulated overnight, transforming ordinary men into millionaires, a siren song of riches. You have heard whispered tales of the California gold rush, the rich silver discoveries in Nevada, and the frenzied mining booms in Colorado. Stories carried on the wind, inspiring desperate hopes. Stories of ordinary individuals with little more than a pickaxe and a dream, unearthing large, shimmering nuggets and becoming instantly prosperous, have drawn hundreds of thousands westward, their imaginations fueled by the allure of easy riches, a powerful, intoxicating dream. What these narratives often omit, however, are the grim realities, the harsh, often brutal, conditions awaiting those who blindly pursue these mineral dreams, the suffering that underpins the wealth. Let's consider, then, that you decide to try your hand at mining, to join the throng seeking their fortune, to stake your claim. What would that truly involve, beyond the romanticized image of striking it rich? Firstly, you would need to stake a claim. which means locating unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits, a task increasingly difficult by the 1870s, as the most accessible and richest areas had been claimed years earlier, leaving only the marginal or deeply hidden veins, requiring more effort for less reward. If you were fortunate enough to find a promising, unclaimed location, a rare stroke of luck, you would then need to register your claim at the nearest government office, often a rough shack, and pay the required fees, which could be considerable, eating into your meager savings before you even began digging. Then, and only then, the genuine, backbreaking labor would begin. And it was, without exaggeration, some of the most physically demanding, dangerous work imaginable, pushing the human body to its absolute limits, extracting mineral wealth from the unyielding earth. For placer mining, which involves searching for loose gold in stream beds, washing gravel and silt, you would spend hours bent over in icy mountain water. Water, your hands submerged in the frigid current, sifting through sediment with a pan or a wooden sluice box, hoping for a glimmer, a speck of gold. Your hands would become cracked, raw, and bleed from constant exposure to the freezing water and abrasive materials, a painful reality that left hands permanently damaged. Your back would ache perpetually from the stooped, unnatural posture, a constant dull throb that never truly subsided. And after all that immense, grueling effort, after hours of relentless labor under harsh conditions, you would be incredibly fortunate to discover a few tiny flecks of gold, barely visible, worth mere pennies. A cruel, meager reward for such exertion and suffering. If you ventured into hard rock mining, which involved digging for veins of ore within the mountains, tunneling deep into the earth, the dangers amplified exponentially, becoming truly terrifying and deadly. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment, proper supports, or engineering knowledge frequently led to sudden, catastrophic cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood, burying them alive in the darkness. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with invisible, yet deadly toxic gases like carbon monoxide suffocate miners who had no forewarning of the peril, collapsing silently. Blasting with black powder or crude dynamite to break through stubborn rock was incredibly hazardous, a truly explosive gamble. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely, or when propelled rock fragments became lethal projectiles, ripping through flesh and bone. The deafening noise and constant vibrations from blasting left many with permanent hearing impairment, a ringing silence that followed them for life. Even if you managed to avoid immediate catastrophes, the long-term health consequences were devastating. A slow, agonizing decline. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis, a painful, incurable lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims, their lungs turning to stone. Mercury, used in the crude gold refinement process, caused neurological damage, uncontrollable tremors, and profound mental decline, turning sharp minds into clouded ones, a tragic descent into madness. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, resulting in chronic illness, debilitating pain, and an early demise, their body succumbing to the poison. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight, operating with a ruthless disregard for human life and well-being. Mine owners prioritized financial gain above all else, over worker well-being, and injuries were considered an expected, unavoidable part of the occupation, a simple cost of doing business in a dangerous trade. Medical care for injured miners was minimal, often non-existent and typically ineffectual, offering little more than a grim prognosis and a painful end. A serious injury, a broken limb or a crushed hand, typically signified the abrupt end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no support for disability, no safety net, leaving them destitute and alone.